Muhammad, the prophet who changed the Arab world forever. Muhammad, 570 to 632 CE, was the founder of Islam and one of the most influential figures in world history. Born in Mecca and orphaned at a young age, he rose from modest beginnings to become a spiritual, political, and military leader who united the Arabian Peninsula. Through revelations believed to be from God, he preached monotheism, justice, compassion, and accountability. His life transformed tribal Arabia into a cohesive moral and religious community. Muhammad's legacy continues to shape over 1 billion lives today, and his story is one of perseverance, vision, and revolutionary leadership. Discover how a man from the desert built a movement that changed the course of global history. How do you think Muhammad's leadership style compares to other major historical leaders? Let us know in the comments. This is BioExplainer, where you'll find the full biographies of the world's most influential historical figures. Subscribe to the channel and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Welcome to another journey through history. Here on BioExplainer, we bring legendary lives back to light. Hit that subscribe button and let's explore together. 1. Birth in Mecca, 570 CE. Muhammad was born around the year 570 CE in the city of Mecca, located in present-day Saudi Arabia, in a region then known as the Hijaz. At the time, Mecca was a significant trading hub and a deeply religious center for the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula. The city housed the Kaaba, a revered sanctuary that attracted pilgrims from various tribes, each worshipping their own deities. The economy of Mecca relied heavily on trade and pilgrimage, with caravans moving goods such as spices, incense, textiles, and leather across the desert. The climate was arid, with extreme daytime heat reaching above 104 degrees Fahrenheit 40 degrees Celsius, and rainfall was rare. Water was precious, and most communities relied on wells and seasonal streams. Life in this desert environment was harsh and often dictated by tribal alliances and kinship ties. Muhammad was born into the Banu Hashim clan, a respected subgroup of the powerful Quraysh tribe. The Quraysh controlled Mecca and its important pilgrimage economy. Although the Banu Hashim did not possess significant wealth, they held a degree of social honor and influence due to their responsibilities in overseeing the maintenance of the Kaaba and assisting pilgrims. His father, Abdullah ibn Abdul Muttalib, died before Muhammad was born. This left the family in a vulnerable position, as economic support typically came through male relatives in a patriarchal tribal structure. Muhammad's mother, Amina bint Wahb, was from the Zura clan, also of the Quraysh. She cared for Muhammad during his earliest years but died when he was only 6 years old. Orphaned at a young age, Muhammad became the responsibility of his paternal grandfather, Abdul Muttalib. This grandfather was a man of great stature in Meccan society, known for his leadership and for digging the Zamzam well, a crucial water source for the city. Abdul Muttalib provided protection and affection, but he too passed away only 2 years later when Muhammad was 8. Following this loss, the young boy was placed under the guardianship of his uncle, Abu Talib, a merchant and respected leader within the Banu Hashim. Though not wealthy, Abu Talib was influential and cared deeply for his nephew. He raised Muhammad alongside his own children and ensured that he was educated in the customs, values, and survival skills of Arabian tribal life. The family likely lived in modest housing made of stone or mud brick, with limited access to amenities common in wealthier urban households of the time. In this formative period, Muhammad experienced firsthand the fragility of life, the importance of kinship bonds, and the realities of social inequality. These early losses, of father, mother, and grandfather, shaped his sense of empathy and his understanding of the struggles faced by the most vulnerable in society. Growing up without the financial advantages of other Quraysh families, he developed a reputation for humility and self-reliance, traits that would later define his leadership and moral character. His early years unfolded during a time when Arabia had no centralized government. Instead, tribes were the basic political units, often governed by councils of elders. Justice was tribal and personal, and feuds could last generations. Religion was polytheistic, and the Kaaba was home to over 300 idols representing different tribal gods. Still, remnants of earlier monotheistic traditions, including Christianity and Judaism, were present in the region, especially among the more literate and isolated communities. These influences would become significant later in Muhammad's life. As a child, Muhammad was not enrolled in formal education, as literacy was rare among the Arabs of the time. Instead, he would have learned through oral storytelling, observation, and practical training in tribal values such as hospitality, honor, courage, and loyalty. He listened to elders recount tales of tribal history, warfare, and wisdom, building an understanding of his people's complex heritage. Many of these narratives were passed down with poetic precision, a hallmark of the strong oral tradition in Arab culture. Despite the challenges of his youth, Muhammad grew into a thoughtful and reflective boy. Known for his quiet demeanor and trustworthiness, he stood out among his peers. By the time he entered adolescence, those around him began to recognize his integrity and sense of justice, qualities that would serve as the foundation for the profound changes he would later bring to his society and the world. 2. Youth and early adulthood in a tribal society. As Muhammad entered adolescence and young adulthood under the care of his uncle Abu Talib, he was gradually introduced to the economic and social realities of Meccan life. The city of Mecca was more than just a religious center, it was also a thriving commercial crossroads. Positioned along major caravan routes that connected the southern Arabian ports with the Roman and Persian empires, Mecca played a crucial role in the regional economy. Goods such as frankincense, myrrh, spices, textiles, and leather moved through the city, and its merchants, including members of the Quraysh tribe, accumulated considerable wealth from these trading activities. Muhammad's early work life began in modest fashion. He took on responsibilities as a shepherd, tending to the flocks of his family and others in the community. This task, while humble, required vigilance, patience, and resilience, qualities that would define his character. In Bedouin and tribal culture, shepherding was seen as an honorable form of labor, often praised for teaching self-reliance and compassion. Several prominent religious figures in the Abrahamic traditions, including Moses and David, were also shepherds, and Muhammad himself later acknowledged this role as a part of his early development. As he grew older, Muhammad accompanied his uncle on trading caravans that traveled north toward Syria and south toward Yemen. These journeys exposed him to the wider world of commerce, diplomacy, and religious diversity. On the trade routes, Muhammad would have encountered Jewish communities, Christians, Zoroastrians, and various Arab polytheists. The experience broadened his understanding of monotheism and the different belief systems that coexisted in the region. Though he remained rooted in the customs of his tribe, these interactions planted seeds of reflection about faith, justice, and human purpose. By his early 20s, Muhammad's reliability, strong work ethic, and ethical conduct earned him the nickname Al-Amin, meaning the trustworthy. This title was not given lightly. In a society where honor, reputation, and social standing were central, to be widely known for honesty was a rare distinction. He was often called upon to mediate disputes, safeguard goods, or represent merchants in contracts. His trustworthiness was considered so absolute that even his critics later acknowledged it, despite opposing his religious teachings. It was during this period that Muhammad's life took a significant turn. A wealthy and respected businesswoman named Khadija bint Khuwaylid, who was about 15 years his senior, heard of his reputation and hired him to lead one of her trading caravans to Syria. Upon his return, Khadija was impressed by both his commercial success and his integrity. She proposed marriage, and Muhammad accepted. Their marriage became one of the most important and influential partnerships in his life. Khadija was a widow from the Quraysh tribe and had inherited considerable wealth from her previous husbands. Despite the prevailing patriarchal norms of Arabian society, she held her own in the business world and was widely respected. With their union, Muhammad gained not only financial stability but also a deep emotional bond. Their marriage was marked by mutual respect and loyalty. They had several children together, including 4 daughters and 2 sons, although both sons died in infancy. Their daughter Fatima would later become a prominent figure in Islamic history. The couple lived a quiet, prosperous life in Mecca. Muhammad continued working in trade, managing Khadija's business affairs and building relationships across tribal and economic lines. They lived modestly compared to Mecca's elite but comfortably enough to support their extended family and occasionally assist the poor. He showed concern for orphans, the enslaved, and those marginalized in Meccan society, groups often neglected or exploited in a system that favored the powerful. During this time, Muhammad was not yet publicly religious in the way that he would become known later. However, his behavior reflected a sense of ethics that went beyond the norms of the tribal honor code. He rejected the widespread idol worship of his peers, avoided drinking alcohol, and remained loyal to one wife in a society where polygamy was common among the wealthy. His sense of moral seriousness and social justice stood in contrast to the hedonism and inequality that characterized many aspects of Meccan elite life. He was increasingly drawn to solitude and reflection, especially as he witnessed the disparity between the city's rich and poor and the prevalence of tribal conflict. Muhammad would often retreat to the cave of Hira, a remote spot in the mountains northeast of Mecca, to think, fast, and meditate. These early contemplations, born from years of observing both the spiritual emptiness and social injustices around him, prepared the ground for what would soon become one of the most transformative moments in religious history. His marriage to Khadija gave him a rare combination of emotional support, financial independence, and social standing that allowed him to pursue these quiet reflections without the immediate pressures of survival. More than a spouse, Khadija was his confidant and protector in the years to come. She was among the first to believe in his mission and remained his most trusted supporter until her death. Muhammad entered his 30s with a deepening sense of purpose, though he could not yet fully name it. In a society ruled by tribal pride and material pursuits, he carried within him a growing discomfort with the status quo. This quiet period of life, as a husband, father, merchant, and seeker, would soon give way to a dramatic spiritual awakening that would alter the course of not only his own life but of world history. Welcome to Bio Explainer, the channel where you discover the biographies of the most important historical figures. If you enjoy this kind of content, you're in the right place. We'd love to get to know you. Tell us where and when you're watching or listening from. Do you have a favorite historical figure? Let us know in the comments, and we'll create a biography video about them. 3. Spiritual Awakening and the Cave of Hira, 610 CE. By the time Muhammad reached the age of 40, the personal discontent he felt toward the spiritual condition of Meccan society had grown deeper and more consuming. Mecca was a city thriving economically but spiritually fragmented. The Kaaba, which was originally linked to Abrahamic traditions, had become filled with idols representing over 300 tribal gods. Religious rituals were largely transactional. Pilgrimages and sacrifices were carried out more for profit and tradition than for spiritual devotion. Corruption, tribal arrogance, and neglect of the poor marked the daily life of many Meccans. For someone like Muhammad, known for integrity and compassion, this moral decay created a sense of unease. To find peace and clarity, he began withdrawing more frequently to the Cave of Hira, located in the rocky hills of Jabal ul-Nu, Mountain of Light, about 2 miles (3.2 kilometers) northeast of Mecca. The climb was steep and isolated, requiring solitude and stamina. Inside the narrow cave, which barely fit a grown man, Muhammad spent his nights meditating, praying in his own way, and contemplating the injustice, inequality, and spiritual confusion he saw around him. He fasted, stayed in silence, and sought answers beyond the polytheistic framework of his society. It was during one of these retreats, in the year 610 CE, that Muhammad experienced a moment that would define the rest of his life. While meditating in Hira, he was suddenly approached by a powerful presence. Later identified as the angel Gabriel, the being commanded him to recite the Arabic word Iqra. Muhammad, startled and unsure of what to say, resisted, claiming he could not recite. The angel embraced him tightly and repeated the command. Finally, verses flowed from Muhammad's lips, later recorded as the opening lines of what would become Surah Al-Alaq, the 96th chapter of the Quran. The passage declared, "Recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging substance. Recite, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not." The experience was overwhelming. Muhammad returned home in a state of confusion, fear, and exhaustion. His heart raced, and he trembled as he entered his house. Seeking reassurance, he turned to Khadija, who comforted him, wrapped him in a blanket, and listened carefully. Far from dismissing his experience, she believed him. She encouraged him to seek counsel and took him to her cousin Waraka ibn Nawfal, an elderly Christian scholar who had studied the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. Waraka listened to Muhammad's story and affirmed its significance. He told him that the same angel who had visited Moses was now visiting him, and that he would face opposition from his people. Despite this affirmation, the emotional weight of the revelation was heavy. Muhammad feared for his sanity and his life. Over the coming days and weeks, he isolated himself further. For a time, the revelations stopped, leading to uncertainty and sadness. But eventually, they resumed, gradually forming the foundational verses of what Muslims would come to believe was divine revelation from Allah, the Arabic word for God. Muhammad did not immediately begin preaching publicly. At first, he shared what he had received only with those closest to him. His wife Khadija, his cousin Ali ibn Abi Talib, his freed servant Zayd ibn Haritha, and his close friend Abu Bakr were among the first to accept his message. These initial followers represented a cross-section of society: family, friends, former slaves, and respected merchants. They saw in Muhammad a man who did not seek power or wealth but truth and justice. The core of his early message was both simple and radical, that there was only one God, the same God of Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, and that all people would be held accountable for their actions on the Day of Judgment. Worship should be directed to this one God alone, and idols should be abandoned. The new faith emphasized moral integrity, charity, equality before God, and compassion for the weak. It condemned the economic exploitation of the poor, the abuse of women, and the tribal feuds that perpetuated violence. In a society dominated by lineage and loyalty to clan, this universalist message posed a threat to the existing order. Still, Muhammad remained focused on personal relationships, delivering his message privately and cautiously. He spent time reflecting, waiting for further revelations, and preparing for the inevitable opposition. It is important to understand how revolutionary this message was in the context of 7th century Arabia. Tribal identity was everything. Loyalty to family and clan trumped almost all other values. Polytheism served to legitimize tribal gods and maintain power structures. By calling for the worship of one unseen god and for loyalty to a universal moral law, Muhammad was not only challenging religious beliefs but threatening social and economic interests. As the number of believers slowly grew, the nature of Muhammad's mission also began to evolve. What had started as a private, personal spiritual awakening was turning into a public movement with the potential to reshape an entire society. The revelations continued to come, often in moments of reflection or in response to events in Muhammad's life. They were preserved orally and memorized by his followers, as literacy remained rare. Over time, scribes began writing them down on various materials: leather, parchment, bones, and palm leaves. These early texts would eventually be compiled into what is now known as the Quran, the central religious text of Islam. Throughout these early years, Muhammad remained deeply reliant on Khadijah. Her emotional support and financial independence gave him the strength to withstand uncertainty and prepare for the difficult years ahead. He had not yet made his message public, but the transformation was underway. What began in the solitude of a mountain cave would soon echo through empires. 4. The early Muslim community and persecution in Mecca. As Muhammad's confidence in his revelations solidified, he began sharing his message beyond his close family and friends. He no longer kept his faith private. What had started as a personal spiritual experience was now evolving into a call for societal change. He began preaching in the streets and markets of Mecca, urging his fellow citizens to abandon idol worship and embrace monotheism. His central message, that there was only one God, Allah, and that humans were accountable for their actions, was simple, but it carried profound consequences for the political and social fabric of Meccan society. The Quraysh elite, who controlled both the economy and religious institutions of Mecca, quickly recognized the danger in Muhammad's words. Their authority was built on a system that tied tribal identity to religious tradition. The Kaaba was not only a spiritual center but also a major source of income through pilgrimage and trade. By calling their gods false and denouncing idol worship, Muhammad was directly challenging the religious legitimacy and economic interests of the ruling class. If his message spread, it threatened to collapse the foundation of their power. The early followers of Muhammad, known as Muslims, meaning those who submit to the will of God, came from various segments of society. Some were slaves and the poor, drawn by the promise of equality and justice in a society that gave them little value. Others were merchants and relatives, like Abu Bakr, who were respected members of the Quraysh. Regardless of their background, these early believers risked their social standing and safety by aligning themselves with Muhammad. As the number of followers grew, so did the resistance. The Quraysh began to pressure Muhammad through both social isolation and open hostility. They mocked his message, accused him of sorcery or madness, and spread rumors to discredit him. In many ways, the tactics resembled the social bullying or character assassination we might recognize today in public campaigns or media manipulation. Yet Muhammad remained composed and steadfast, refusing to insult the idols or retaliate in kind. The persecution quickly escalated beyond insults. Wealthy Quraysh leaders imposed economic and social sanctions on the Muslims. Some followers, particularly those from lower classes or without tribal protection, were tortured or even killed. One of the most well-known early martyrs was Sumayya bint Kayat, a slave who was brutally murdered by her master for refusing to renounce Islam. Her death marked a turning point, showing how seriously the Meccan elite viewed the threat of Muhammad's message. Others, like Bilal ibn Rabah, a black slave of Abyssinian origin, were tied to the desert ground and tortured under the sun, forced to repeat the names of Meccan gods. But Bilal, like many others, remained firm, repeating instead the word Ahad, one, in reference to the oneness of God. His resistance made him a symbol of spiritual endurance and highlighted the universal appeal of Islam across racial and class lines, something particularly relevant to American readers today, as issues of racial equality and civil rights remain powerful social themes. As pressure mounted, Muhammad encouraged some of his followers to seek refuge in Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, a Christian kingdom ruled by King Negus, also known as al-Najashi. The king was known for his fairness and tolerance. This emigration, known as the First Hijra, marked Islam's first international encounter and showed the Prophet's willingness to seek peaceful alternatives in times of oppression. The refugees were received kindly and allowed to practice their faith freely. This episode also illustrates early Islamic recognition of Christian values and shared Abrahamic beliefs, a theme that would reappear throughout Islamic history. Back in Mecca, things continued to deteriorate. Muhammad and his followers were eventually boycotted by the Quraysh and forced to live in a narrow mountain pass known as Shabi Abi Talib. The boycott lasted around 3 years and involved cutting off trade, marriage, and communication with the Muslims and their supporters. Food became scarce, and hunger was widespread. According to early reports, leaves and leather were sometimes eaten to survive. Yet despite the suffering, few abandoned the faith. During this time of hardship, 2 of Muhammad's closest supporters died, his wife Khadija and his uncle Abu Talib. Their deaths occurred within weeks of each other, in what became known as the Year of Sorrow, Aam al-Huzn. Khadija had been his emotional anchor and financier, while Abu Talib had been his protector from physical harm, using his tribal influence to shield Muhammad from violence. With both gone, Muhammad was more vulnerable than ever. The Quraysh leaders, sensing his diminished protection, increased their efforts to silence him. At one point, they offered Muhammad wealth, status, and leadership if he would stop preaching. He refused. The message was not for sale. To him, this was not a political movement or a call for power, it was a divine obligation. One of the key social dimensions of this period is how Muhammad dealt with rejection. Rather than respond with violence, he remained committed to peace and dialogue. He never retaliated against those who mocked or harassed him, reinforcing the importance of patience, sabr, and forgiveness, rahmah, in his message. Muhammad continued to preach whenever and wherever he could, often in secret, sometimes in public. He visited markets, met with traveling tribes, and shared his vision of a just society based on moral accountability, compassion for the weak, and devotion to one God. These values were universal and echoed the ethical foundations found in the Hebrew Bible and Christian Gospels, yet they were radical in Mecca's tribal, polytheistic world. By the end of this period, the early Muslim community had been tested through hunger, torture, isolation, and grief. Yet their numbers slowly continued to grow. They remained loyal not because of coercion or promises of wealth, but because they believed in the message. The foundation of a movement had been laid, not through conquest or political power, but through resilience, conviction, and the moral leadership of one man who believed that faith, justice, and unity could transform the world. 5. The Night Journey and Ascension, Isra and Mi'raj. Following the intense hardships of persecution and personal loss, Muhammad experienced an event that would become one of the most profound and mystical moments in Islamic tradition. Known as Isra and Mi'raj, this spiritual journey took place around the year 621 CE, during a time when his influence in Mecca remained fragile and his emotional support system had been deeply shaken. His wife Khadija and his protective uncle Abu Talib had both died, and many of his followers were scattered or living under constant threat. Against this backdrop, the night journey became a turning point, one that offered both divine reassurance and theological significance. According to early Muslim accounts, Muhammad was taken by night from the Kaaba in Mecca to a distant location referred to as Al-Aqsa, commonly understood as Jerusalem. This phase of the event is known as Isra, or the night journey. He was said to have traveled on a celestial creature called Burak, described as a white, winged steed larger than a donkey but smaller than a mule. In a single night, Muhammad crossed hundreds of miles, over 760 miles, 1,220 kilometers, a journey that, in physical terms, would have taken weeks by caravan. In religious terms, however, it transcended space and time. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, Muhammad was brought to the sacred area where the Dome of the Rock now stands. There, he met with previous prophets including Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, and led them in prayer. This symbolic gesture reinforced Islam's connection to earlier Abrahamic traditions, positioning Muhammad not as a new founder but as the final messenger in a long line of prophetic voices. The second part of the journey, known as Mi'raj, Ascension, describes Muhammad's ascent through the 7 levels of heaven. In each level, he encountered a different prophet: Adam, John the Baptist, Jesus, Joseph, Idris, Enoch, Aaron, Moses, and finally Abraham at the highest level. These encounters were not just personal greetings, they carried moral and spiritual lessons that Muhammad would later relay to his followers. At the peak of this celestial journey, Muhammad entered the divine presence, referred to in Islamic tradition as Sidrat al-Muntaha, or the Lot tree of the utmost boundary. It was there that, according to tradition, God commanded that Muslims pray 50 times a day. On his descent, Muhammad consulted with Moses, who suggested that the burden was too heavy for people to bear. Muhammad returned to ask for a reduction. Eventually, the number of required daily prayers was set at 5, which remains a core practice in Islam to this day. From a religious perspective, this event served multiple purposes. It reinforced Muhammad's legitimacy among earlier prophets, established Jerusalem as a sacred city for Muslims, and provided the ritual framework for daily prayer, salat. But beyond its theological meaning, the night journey also carried psychological and political symbolism. For a man under siege, facing rejection and isolation, it was a message of divine support and cosmic affirmation that his mission was not only just but divinely ordained. To the Quraysh and many in Mecca, however, the story sounded absurd. They mocked Muhammad, asking how a man could travel to Jerusalem and return in a single night. It was a challenge not only to logic but to tribal authority. Yet Muhammad remained firm. According to tradition, when some followers wavered in their belief, Abu Bakr famously responded, "If Muhammad says so, it must be true," earning him the title as-Siddiq, or the Truthful. For American readers today, this moment might be compared in significance to Moses receiving the Ten Commandments or Paul's vision on the road to Damascus. While modern readers may struggle with the literal truth of such an event, within its historical and theological context, the night journey served as a divine endorsement of Muhammad's role, much like visions and miracles in other religious traditions. It's also important to recognize that the night journey emphasized spiritual mobility over physical power. At a time when Muhammad had no army, no territory, and few resources, he was granted a journey beyond the earth and heavens. This narrative shifted the battlefield from the physical world to the moral and metaphysical realms, framing Muhammad's mission as a cosmic responsibility rather than a tribal cause. Despite its ridicule in Mecca, the story became a source of inspiration for his followers. It reinforced their belief that their struggles were part of a larger plan. The Quran would later refer to this journey in Surah Al-Isra, chapter 17, describing it as a sign for believers. The mystical nature of the event and its layered symbolism helped lay the spiritual foundations for what was soon to become a new phase in Muhammad's mission. Though the event did not immediately change his circumstances in Mecca, it did set the stage for a broader transformation. Rejected by his own people, Muhammad began to look beyond his birthplace for a community that would embrace his message. His next destination would not only offer safety but the opportunity to build an entirely new society, one founded not on tribal divisions but on shared belief and collective responsibility. 6. The Hijra to Medina and the formation of a Muslim state, 622 CE. By 622 CE, more than a decade had passed since Muhammad began preaching in Mecca. During that time, the resistance he faced had intensified into full-scale hostility. Attempts to preach his message peacefully were met with harassment, economic sanctions, and violence. While his followers remained loyal, many were dispersed or living under constant threat. Muhammad himself was isolated, his social protection lost with the death of his uncle Abu Talib. With no sign that the Quraysh would ease their opposition, Muhammad began to seek a new base of support beyond Mecca. That opportunity came from a group of pilgrims who had traveled to Mecca from the city of Yathrib, located approximately 210 miles, 340 kilometers, to the north. These pilgrims, composed of members of two major tribes, the Aws and the Khazraj, had long suffered from internal tribal conflict and were seeking a figure who could mediate between them. They had heard of Muhammad's reputation as a trustworthy and just leader. After several meetings with him, they began to embrace his teachings and agreed to support him. They pledged to protect him as they would their own families. In the summer of 622 CE, Muhammad instructed his followers to begin emigrating to Yathrib, doing so in small groups to avoid detection by the Quraysh. This migration, known as the Hijra, marked the turning point in Islamic history. It wasn't just a change in geography, it represented the transition from persecution to empowerment, from a private spiritual mission to a public social movement. Muhammad and his close companion Abu Bakr were among the last to leave Mecca. Their journey was dangerous. Aware that Muhammad was leaving, the Quraysh plotted to assassinate him. According to accounts, young men from various tribes were selected to carry out the murder so that blame would be shared collectively, preventing revenge from any one clan. Learning of the plot, Muhammad and Abu Bakr escaped under the cover of night and took refuge in a cave called Thor, located south of Mecca. There, they hid for 3 days before continuing their journey to Yathrib. The route to Yathrib was treacherous. The journey took over a week through harsh desert terrain, with scorching daytime temperatures often exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit 43 degrees Celsius. The two men traveled by foot and camel, taking less traveled paths to avoid pursuit. They arrived safely in Yathrib, where they were welcomed by the local Muslim community and tribal allies. The city would soon become known as Medinat an-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, or simply Medina. Upon his arrival, Muhammad was no longer merely a preacher. He became a statesman, judge, military strategist, and spiritual leader. His first move was to establish brotherhood, mu'akhah, between the emigrants from Mecca, muhajirun, and the local converts in Medina, ansar. These pairings helped distribute wealth and responsibility, forming a united community, or ummah, based not on blood ties or tribal affiliations but on shared belief. To create a just and peaceful society, Muhammad drafted what is known today as the Constitution of Medina. This document is considered one of the earliest examples of a written social contract in recorded history. It outlined the rights and responsibilities of all residents of Medina, including Jews, Muslims, and other non-Muslim tribes. It guaranteed freedom of religion, collective defense, mutual consultation, and the right of each group to maintain its own customs as long as peace was preserved. In the context of 7th century Arabia, where power was enforced through tribal dominance, the constitution was revolutionary. Muhammad also oversaw the construction of a mosque, which became not only a place of worship but a center for education, governance, and community meetings. Made of mud bricks and palm trunks, it reflected the humility of the new Muslim society. He lived in a simple dwelling next to the mosque, accessible to anyone who needed his guidance or counsel. His leadership style was inclusive and consultative. Decisions were made collectively, with input from men and women, rich and poor. The people of Medina accepted Muhammad not only because of his religious teachings but because of his ability to mediate conflict and offer a vision of unity. Tribal feuds that had persisted for generations gradually dissolved as former enemies stood side by side in prayer and common cause. His moral authority, clear sense of justice, and commitment to serving the vulnerable gave him legitimacy beyond doctrine. Economically, Medina functioned through agriculture and trade, particularly in dates, wheat, and livestock. Muhammad established systems of fair trade, discouraged hoarding, and encouraged ethical business practices. He emphasized contracts, honesty in transactions, and protection of the poor. These policies helped stabilize the economy and build trust between different social groups. Despite these achievements, the transition was not without tension. Some Medinan tribes had not fully embraced Muhammad's authority, and external threats from Mecca still loomed. Jewish tribes who had initially welcomed Muhammad began to resist as his influence expanded. Tensions would later escalate into political and military conflicts. But at this early stage, the formation of a peaceful, pluralistic society marked one of Muhammad's greatest accomplishments. The Hijra became so central to the Islamic worldview that it marked the beginning of the Islamic calendar. In the modern U.S. system, we often measure history in terms of political revolutions or foundational documents like the Constitution. For Muslims, the Hijra is a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and the creation of a moral community built not by conquest but by shared values and mutual commitment. From an American perspective, this episode echoes foundational moments like the Pilgrim's Voyage to the New World or the civil rights marches of the 20th century, times when individuals left behind comfort and familiarity in pursuit of a higher moral vision. Like those examples, Muhammad's journey to Medina was more than migration, it was a declaration of faith and a step towards societal transformation. 7. Conflicts with Mecca, battles of Badr, Uhud, and the Trench. Although Medina offered Muhammad and his followers sanctuary, peace with Mecca was far from achieved. The Quraysh, still dominant in the region, viewed Muhammad's growing influence as a threat, not only to their economic interests but to their political supremacy. Tribal honor demanded retaliation. Tensions quickly escalated into open conflict, and over the next few years, several key battles defined the struggle between the nascent Muslim community and the Quraysh elite. These confrontations were not simply military events, they were moral and existential turning points that would shape the identity and unity of the Muslim community for generations. The first and most famous of these was the Battle of Badr, which occurred in 624 CE, roughly 2 years after the Hijra. It began not as a planned military confrontation but as an attempt by the Muslims to intercept a Quraysh trade caravan returning from Syria. The caravan, led by Abu Sufyan, was heavily protected due to rising tensions. When Abu Sufyan learned of Muhammad's intent to intercept it, he sent word to Mecca requesting reinforcements. The Quraysh responded by dispatching a force of roughly 1,000 men, including their best warriors, to protect the caravan and assert their strength. Muhammad, in contrast, led a much smaller group, around 313 fighters, many of whom were poorly equipped. The Muslims had just 2 horses and about 70 camels, compared to the Quraysh's full cavalry and weaponry. The battle took place near the wells of Badr, southwest of Medina, a strategic location where water access would be crucial. Despite being outnumbered more than 3 to 1, the Muslims won a decisive victory. According to Islamic tradition, the triumph was seen as a sign of divine support. The Quran described the battle as a day when truth was distinguished from falsehood. Several prominent Quraysh leaders were killed, including Abu Jahl, one of Muhammad's most vocal enemies. The victory boosted the morale and legitimacy of the Muslim community, transforming their image from a persecuted sect into a rising force. The Battle of Badr was more than a military win, it marked the beginning of Islamic self-confidence. It unified the community around shared sacrifice and faith, and it demonstrated that military power did not solely rest in numbers or weapons but in strategy, discipline, and conviction. For American readers, this battle could be likened to the Battle of Lexington in 1775, a smaller force defeating a dominant power, not through brute force but through commitment and purpose. But the momentum was short-lived. The following year, in 625 CE, the Quraysh launched a retaliatory strike, resulting in the Battle of Uhud. This time, the Meccans brought around 3,000 soldiers to Medina's doorstep. Muhammad initially positioned his forces strategically near Mount Uhud, north of the city. His plan relied on controlling a key mountain pass through a team of archers, whom he strictly instructed not to leave their posts under any circumstances. At first, the Muslim forces gained the upper hand, forcing the Quraysh into retreat. But as victory appeared certain, the archers disobeyed Muhammad's orders and left their position to collect spoils from the battlefield. This created a vulnerability that Khalid ibn al-Walid, a brilliant Quraysh commander, exploited by flanking the Muslims with a cavalry charge. The Muslims suffered heavy losses, and Muhammad himself was injured. His uncle, Hamza, one of the most beloved and courageous Muslim warriors, was killed and mutilated on the battlefield. The defeat at Uhud was devastating. It tested the faith of the believers and exposed the dangers of disobedience and complacency. For Muhammad, it was a moment of painful reflection but also resilience. He did not blame the community but reminded them that faith must endure both triumph and trial. The Quran addressed this moment directly, offering moral and spiritual lessons. Rather than discouraging the Muslims, the setback strengthened their resolve and refined their discipline. 2 years later, in 627 CE, the Meccans and their allies launched a final and much larger assault on Medina. Known as the Battle of the Trench, or Ghazwat al-Khandaq, this confrontation was unlike the previous two. It involved an alliance of Quraysh, Bedouin tribes, and Jewish factions, an estimated 10,000 men, determined to crush Muhammad's growing influence once and for all. Facing overwhelming odds, Muhammad turned to a new form of defense. On the advice of Salman al-Farsi, a Persian convert, the Muslims dug a wide trench around the vulnerable parts of Medina, a tactic unfamiliar to Arabian warfare at the time. The trench effectively prevented the enemy cavalry from penetrating the city. The siege dragged on for nearly a month, during which the defenders endured hunger, cold nights, and psychological strain. Eventually, internal divisions and poor weather weakened the enemy alliance. Failing to breach the trench or force surrender, the Quraysh withdrew. It was a turning point. Although no major battle occurred, the successful defense of Medina marked the end of Mecca's military dominance. The siege had drained their resources and morale, while Medina stood firm under Muhammad's leadership. During the siege, tensions within Medina also reached a critical point. A Jewish tribe, Banu Qurayza, was accused of conspiring with the Quraysh. After the battle, the tribe was besieged, and a controversial judgment was made by Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, a tribal leader. The adult males of the Banu Qurayza were executed, while women and children were taken captive. This decision remains a subject of historical debate and ethical scrutiny, even among Muslim scholars. It reflected the harsh realities of tribal warfare in the 7th century, where betrayals were often punished severely. By the end of this period, Muhammad's position had transformed completely. Once a refugee from Mecca, he was now the unquestioned leader of Medina and the head of a growing religious political community. His authority extended beyond spiritual matters to governance, law, diplomacy, and military strategy. These battles, Badr, Uhud, and the Trench, collectively reshaped the Muslim community's identity. They taught perseverance, obedience, unity, and the costs of both arrogance and disloyalty. They also demonstrated that the Prophet's leadership was adaptable, bold in offense, cautious in defense, and always focused on the long-term vision of building a just society. 8. Treaty of Hudaybiyah and the spread of Islam. By 628 CE, Muhammad's influence in Arabia had grown substantially. After the failed siege of Medina by the Quraysh and their allies during the Battle of the Trench, the political landscape had shifted. While the Quraysh remained hostile, their confidence was shaken. The Muslim community, now firmly rooted in Medina, had survived multiple assaults and was beginning to form alliances with neighboring tribes. Muhammad, recognizing this new balance of power, began to think beyond warfare and toward a broader strategy of diplomacy and religious outreach. That year, he made a bold and unexpected move. Despite ongoing tensions with the Quraysh, Muhammad announced his intention to lead a peaceful pilgrimage, known as an Umrah, to the Kaaba in Mecca. He and his followers prepared in a non-violent manner. They wore the simple white garments of pilgrimage, ihram, carried no weapons beyond the customary travel gear, and brought along sacrificial animals. Around 1,400 Muslims joined the journey, many of whom had not seen their homeland since the Hijra 6 years earlier. When the Quraysh learned of the caravan, they feared an armed invasion and dispatched cavalry to intercept Muhammad's group near a place called Hudaybiyah, just outside Mecca. The situation became tense, with negotiations starting and stalling multiple times. Despite the growing frustration among his followers, Muhammad remained committed to diplomacy. He sent emissaries, including Uthman ibn Affan, to negotiate a peaceful entry into Mecca. After days of dialogue, a treaty was drafted. Known as the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, its terms seemed, at first glance, deeply unfavorable to the Muslims. Among the conditions, Muhammad and his followers would not enter Mecca that year but could return the following year for a pilgrimage. A 10-year truce was agreed upon between the Muslims and Quraysh. Additionally, any Meccan who defected to Medina without the permission of their guardian would be returned, while defectors from Medina to Mecca would not be returned. Many of Muhammad's followers were shocked. They had hoped for spiritual vindication by entering the Kaaba and saw the terms as a humiliating compromise. Umar ibn al-Khattab, a close companion, even questioned the decision openly. Yet Muhammad stood firm, explaining that peace would allow Islam to spread in ways that war never could. He viewed the treaty as a strategic victory, not a defeat. Events soon proved him right. The Quraysh, for all their power, had effectively recognized Muhammad as an equal party. This legitimized his leadership in the eyes of the region. Furthermore, the 10-year peace opened the door for safe travel, trade, and communication across tribal lines. In the months that followed, more people converted to Islam than in all the previous years combined. Historians estimate that by the time of the treaty, the Muslim community had numbered in the low thousands. By the time Mecca was conquered 2 years later, it had grown to over 10,000. During this period, Muhammad sent letters to the rulers of major empires, including the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, the Sasanian Emperor Khosrow II, and the Negus al-Najashi of Abyssinia, inviting them to embrace Islam. While the political responses varied, the outreach itself marked a transition. Muhammad was no longer a local preacher or refugee leader. He was now acting as a diplomat and head of state, communicating directly with global powers. Within Arabia, alliances shifted rapidly. Many tribes, seeing the stability and justice of the Muslim community in Medina, began making treaties with Muhammad. His movement was gaining legitimacy not just through religious conviction but through political influence. As conversions increased, so did administrative responsibilities. Muhammad appointed governors, judges, and military commanders, roles that laid the foundation for a future Islamic state. One of the most noteworthy results of this period was the internal strengthening of the Muslim community. Peace allowed them to focus on education, governance, and moral teaching. The Quran continued to be revealed in response to both personal and communal matters, offering guidance on everything from marriage and commerce to ethics and warfare. Muhammad continued to lead by example, modeling humility and fairness even as his power grew. He remained accessible to the public, resolving disputes, visiting the sick, and participating in manual labor alongside his followers. The wisdom of the Hudaybiyah Treaty became undeniable in 629 CE, when a group of Meccans violated the truce by attacking a tribe allied with Muhammad. This breach of the treaty provided him with both the legal and moral grounds to march on Mecca without betraying his commitment to peace. But by that time, the groundwork had already been laid. Islam had become a recognized force in Arabia, and Muhammad had demonstrated that strength did not have to come through conquest. It could be achieved through restraint, strategy, and unwavering faith. From an American historical perspective, this moment resembles pivotal episodes where diplomacy took precedence over war to secure long-term goals, like the Monroe Doctrine, or more recently, major civil rights legal settlements that paved the way for broader systemic change. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah, while controversial at the time, became a masterclass in leadership and the power of patience. Rather than forcing entry into Mecca, Muhammad's vision extended beyond one symbolic victory. He was preparing for the long-term transformation of the Arabian Peninsula, one that would soon come to pass. 9. Conquest of Mecca and the unification of Arabia. By early 630 CE, less than 2 years after the signing of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the political landscape of Arabia had shifted dramatically. Muhammad's strategic patience had paid off. Islam had expanded well beyond Medina, with numerous tribes across the Arabian Peninsula pledging allegiance to him. These pledges were not merely spiritual declarations, they were political alignments, strengthening Muhammad's position as a unifying leader. The fragile truce between the Muslims and the Quraysh was shattered when a Meccan-allied tribe, the Banu Bakr, attacked the Banu Khuzrā, a tribe aligned with the Muslims. This act was a direct violation of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The Banu Khuzrā appealed to Muhammad for protection. Seeing the treaty broken, Muhammad now had legal and ethical justification to act decisively. Rather than retaliate through isolated warfare, Muhammad mobilized a massive force, over 10,000 men, including fighters from various allied tribes and new Muslim converts. It was the largest army Arabia had ever seen. The objective was clear: to reclaim Mecca, not in vengeance but in fulfillment of a long-delayed mission. Importantly, Muhammad aimed for a peaceful entry, hoping to avoid bloodshed and further division. The Muslim army advanced steadily, setting up camp near Mecca. The Quraysh, realizing they could not resist such a force, were thrown into confusion. Abu Sufyan, now the leading figure among the Quraysh, sought a diplomatic solution. He met with Muhammad and eventually accepted Islam. In return, Muhammad granted him and his household safety, setting a precedent for others in Mecca. As the Muslim army entered the city, Muhammad issued strict orders to avoid harming civilians, damaging property, or looting. The entry into Mecca was largely peaceful, with only minor resistance. This restraint, rare in ancient military campaigns, left a lasting impression on the population. For many Americans familiar with historical examples of conquest through destruction, such as the Roman sack of Jerusalem or medieval European wars, Muhammad's approach to Mecca stands out for its mercy and discipline. Upon reaching the Kaaba, Muhammad performed the ritual of tawaf, circling the sacred sanctuary. He then ordered the removal of the idols that had filled the shrine. Over 360 statues were taken down and destroyed. The Kaaba was rededicated to the worship of one God, restoring what Muhammad believed was its original purpose from the time of Abraham and Ishmael. Standing before the people of Mecca, many of whom had persecuted him, mocked him, and driven him from his home, Muhammad delivered a powerful address. He said, "There is no blame upon you today. You are free." This act of forgiveness was not just a personal gesture. It was a political decision to unify, rather than punish, a fractured society. By forgiving his enemies and integrating them into the new Muslim order, Muhammad prevented a cycle of revenge that could have torn Arabia apart. He abolished old tribal privileges, proclaimed equality among believers, and emphasized the universal message of Islam: submission to God and justice for all. The response from the Meccans was overwhelming. Many who had previously resisted Muhammad now embraced Islam, not out of fear, but from witnessing the integrity and mercy of his leadership. Conversion became widespread. Influential Quraysh leaders joined the movement, and Mecca became not only a spiritual capital but the political heart of the emerging Islamic State. Over the next several months, Muhammad focused on consolidating control and dismantling remaining pockets of opposition. He led expeditions to Hawazin, Ta'if, and other areas where resistance persisted. Some battles were fought, notably the Battle of Hunain, but the trend was clear: Islam was now the dominant force in Arabia. Importantly, Muhammad's administration avoided the imposition of Islam through coercion. Tribes that allied with the Muslims retained autonomy in many local matters, and non-Muslims, including Christians and Jews, were generally allowed to practice their faith under specific agreements. The emphasis was on justice, order, and loyalty to the new constitution rather than forced religious conformity. Economically, the unification of Arabia under Muhammad created new trade stability. Caravans could travel safely across formerly hostile tribal zones, boosting commerce between Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. This economic integration helped to reinforce political unity and encouraged even more tribes to join the Islamic movement. Muhammad also standardized religious rituals, uniting diverse communities under shared practices like daily prayer, fasting during Ramadan, almsgiving, zakat, and pilgrimage to Mecca, Hajj. These practices were not only spiritual but helped foster a collective identity, essential for any emerging nation. In this phase, Muhammad demonstrated that true leadership requires magnanimity, not domination. His peaceful conquest of Mecca showed that strength can be tempered with mercy, and that ideological movements rooted in justice can transcend the traditional power structures of their time. For American readers, this moment resonates with historical parallels such as Abraham Lincoln's approach to reconciliation after the Civil War, or George Washington's decision to relinquish power rather than become a monarch. In both cases, moral authority was strengthened, not by extending control, but by rejecting the temptation to abuse it. With Mecca under Muslim control and the major Arabian tribes aligning with Muhammad, the unification of the Arabian Peninsula was nearly complete. This rapid transformation, from an orphan in Mecca to the most powerful figure in Arabia, was not achieved through dynasty or conquest alone, but through a mix of vision, perseverance, diplomacy, and spiritual conviction. Muhammad had turned enemies into allies, war into peace, and a scattered people into a nation united by belief. Arabia was no longer a mosaic of warring tribes, it was a single community with a common faith, preparing for a future that would reach far beyond its deserts. 10. Final years in Medina and the last revelation, 632 CE. After the peaceful conquest of Mecca and the subsequent unification of most of the Arabian Peninsula, Muhammad returned to Medina, the city that had first embraced his mission and where the foundations of the Muslim community had been laid. Despite now being the most influential figure in Arabia, Muhammad maintained a life of simplicity. His home remained modest, a set of mud brick rooms adjacent to the mosque, and his leadership style continued to emphasize humility, justice, and service to others. In the final 2 years of his life, Muhammad focused on governance, religious education, and legal structures that would preserve unity after his death. Delegations from across Arabia traveled to Medina to declare allegiance to him and to Islam. These visits were formal, but also opportunities for education and negotiation. Muhammad received guests with hospitality, discussed terms of governance, and taught them the essential practices of the faith. He emphasized that leadership was a trust, not a privilege, and frequently warned against corruption, arrogance, and oppression. As the Muslim community expanded, Muhammad delegated authority to capable governors and judges across various regions. These appointments were based on merit, piety, and integrity, rather than tribal rank or wealth. His administrative system included public treasury management, Bayt al-Mal, fair taxation, protection of religious minorities, and resolution of legal disputes. The system provided an early model of Islamic governance, which would be refined by later Muslim rulers. Even in the height of power, Muhammad remained accessible to the public. People approached him with personal disputes, questions about faith, and appeals for help. He responded with fairness and compassion. He emphasized the rights of women, orphans, and the poor, teaching that the strongest among society had a duty to protect the weakest. His speeches, often delivered during Friday sermons or informal gatherings, were direct and practical, touching on issues of everyday life, trade, family, ethics, and justice. In 632 CE, Muhammad announced his intention to perform the Hajj, the major pilgrimage to Mecca that had now been fully restored to monotheistic worship. Tens of thousands of Muslims from across Arabia joined him. It was the first and only Hajj he performed after the migration to Medina, and it became known as the Farewell Pilgrimage. During this pilgrimage, Muhammad delivered what would become his most famous and final public address, the Farewell Sermon. Standing on Mount Arafat, he spoke to the gathered multitudes. His message emphasized equality, justice, and the sanctity of life. He declared, "O people, your Lord is one, and your Father is one. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor does a non-Arab have superiority over an Arab, except by piety and good action." He abolished ancient tribal blood feuds, reinforced the rights of women, and reminded his followers to treat each other with kindness. He warned that he would not be with them much longer, and urged them to adhere to the Quran and his teachings. The message was clear: Islam's moral principles were to guide future generations long after his departure. Shortly after returning to Medina, Muhammad fell ill. His sickness lasted several days, and his strength declined steadily. He chose to stay in the room of his wife Aisha, which was attached to the mosque. During this time, he continued to lead prayers when able, but gradually appointed Abu Bakr to take his place, signaling to many that he viewed Abu Bakr as his most trusted deputy. His final moments were marked by quiet dignity. According to Aisha, he rested with his head on her lap, murmuring prayers. Among his last words were, "O Allah, with the highest companion." These words reflected his readiness to return to God. Muhammad died in June 632 CE, at approximately 62 years old. His death stunned the Muslim community. Many found it difficult to accept. Umar ibn al-Khattab reportedly denied that Muhammad had died, until Abu Bakr addressed the people and reminded them, "Whoever worshipped Muhammad, know that Muhammad is dead. But whoever worships God, know that God is alive and never dies." Muhammad was buried in the very room where he had died, Aisha's chamber beside the mosque. Today, that room lies beneath the green dome of the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, and it remains one of the holiest sites in Islam. By the time of his death, Muhammad had transformed a fragmented and tribal Arabian Peninsula into a unified moral community, guided by the principles of monotheism, justice, compassion, and accountability. He had led by example, never hoarding wealth, never abusing power, and always serving those in need. His legacy was not just a religion but a civilization that would stretch from Spain to Southeast Asia in the centuries to come. For American readers, Muhammad's final years can be understood not simply in religious terms, but as the culmination of a moral and social revolution. Like other historic figures who reshaped society, Frederick Douglass, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Muhammad combined personal integrity, vision, and unshakable faith in the possibility of a better world. He left no wealth behind, no castles or palaces. What he left was a message, a community, and a profound example of leadership based not on domination, but on responsibility. Thanks for watching. Here are 2 more videos we think you'll love. First, Napoleon Bonaparte, Rise of an Empire. Hi, I'm Alessio, Jesus of Nazareth, his life and times. Each week we uncover the life of someone who changed the world. Subscribe now, and never miss a story worth remembering.